Good morning, everyone, and welcome to I believe it's the sixth installment, forgot to look, of our exploration of Rebecca. I'm going to start today with an article by someone named Teresa Peterson from the Macquarie University in Australia. She says, this is about a third of the way through the article. One of the stock elements of Gothic fiction is the introduction of a mystery early in the narrative. Du Maurier does not give her protagonist a name. When questioned why, she said she could not think of one, and it became a challenge in technique. And the easier she was writing because she was writing from the first person. I agree with Richard Kelly's observation that by making that naive, nameless second Mrs. De Winter the narrator, Du Maurier is able to develop and sustain the mystery plot while she explores the central question of identity. Isn't that interesting? After the dream sequence, the narrative moves on to the narrator and her husband, Maxime, who are living in exile in Europe. Part of Du Maurier's narrative strategy is to create mystery by withholding information. We're going to see that throughout. It is not made clear at this point of the narrative, she's talking about at the beginning, why they are living in exile. What is clear is they are leading boring, mechanical lives, as the narrator herself acknowledges. She says, the narrator says, I know we are together, we march in unison, no clash of thought or of opinion makes a barrier between us. That's an interesting quote because we are now 2/3 of the way through the book, and much of the I speaker's point of view. My glasses are crooked. I know. I hate that. Much of what the I speaker does throughout the novel is tries to figure out where she fits in. What does Maxine think of her? She frets overly about Mrs. Danvers and what she thinks of her and what the staff thinks of her. But in this very beginning part, she acknowledges that at the end of the narrative, she and Maxime are working in unison. Another couple of points that this author says, she says, in Rebecca, the color red connotes physical violence. The night sky above Manderley is crimson like a splash of blood. The drive that leads to Manderley is flanked by rhododendrons that are blood red with crimson faces and slaughterhouse red. Those descriptions are almost horrifying. She goes on to say Rebecca's presence pervades Manderley to the extent that she seems alive. And a little bit later, this author goes on, one of the stock devices of the Gothic novel is the haunted house, and its gendered and ideological construction as a woman's place is used by Du Maurier to signify the containment of women within traditional power structures. If you think of the second Mrs. De Winter, the I speaker, as contained by the novel, and she is contained within the traditional power structures. We're going to see that throughout. Let's see if I have anything else marked in this essay. A little bit here. Mrs. Danvers asserts that Rebecca is the real Mrs. De Winter. We're going to see that today. Whereas the narrator is the shadow and the ghost, thus invoking the uncanny by bringing Rebecca back to life and dismissing the narrator into the realm of the dead. That was an interesting point, because Rebecca is pervasive. She's all over this novel. So, towards the conclusion of this article, the narrator says, much to Du Maurier's disappointment, the Times review of Rebecca was fairly dismissive. It stated that the material is of the humblest, and nothing in this is beyond the novelette. And we see this in the criticism. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I really enjoy this novel. The review noted the atmosphere of terror, but saw it as a deterrent because it made it easy to overlook the weaknesses and rated it romance in the grand tradition, and that's in quotation marks. Other critics have dismissed the novel as melodrama and stress its popular appeal. And I think what happened to this novel is that it sold so many copies, it was so popular that it was dismissed because of its popularity. Um, Overtly, the narrative does resemble what could be called a romance plot, or to suggest something not dissimilar, if not by any means the same, a Cinderella story. A penniless young woman, saved by marriage to a rich, handsome man who elevates her to a high social position in society. We see the eye speaker so out of sorts in the novel, she just doesn't fit in anywhere. She doesn't even know how to deal with the servants. Not that I would, but anyway. However, as has been pointed out, to read the novel as a conventional Gothic romance plot is to underread it, because such a reading ignores the pervasive presence of dark forces that are at work on a subliminal level. And we will examine that as we go. I have a note to myself. Let's see, where do we go here? And yeah, we are going to start today with chapter 14. It's probably the creepiest in the entire novel. Mrs. Danvers has a hold of Rebecca's presence. Oh, and I have another note here. I'm supposed to look at the East versus West. Where did I go? Danvers, flowers, they're alive. Well, I'm sure I'll find it. I read that to you already. I did that. Okay. Well, we'll come back to it when I find it. Oh, here it is. East versus West. So this chapter firmly establishes Mrs. Danvers as a sinister presence. But what we are also looking at is the contrast between the East Wing and the West Wing. East is where the current couple lives, and West is where the previous couple lives. So at Manderley, much is made of the difference between the West Wing, where Maxime and Rebecca lived, and the East Wing, where Maxime and Mrs. De Winter lived, the current. The West Wing overlooks the ocean and the woods. It is framed by blood-red rhododendrons, which Rebecca herself cultivated, and which also are used to decorate the morning room, also Rebecca's personal domain with the desk, etc. Um, Creepily, Mrs. Danvers tries to preserve the room as it was when Rebecca was alive. Did I read that to you? The East Wing has just had an expensive, I think I read this already. Perhaps Maxime wants to live an innocent life, free from the wild, unpredictable life with Rebecca, which the West Wing represents. And the East Wing represents the more innocent, current Mrs. De Winter. So let's go to chapter 14, which is page 167. The narrator tells us that there was no sound at all. I was aware of the same musty, unused smell that had been there before. Now, imagine this is quite the mansion, and it would have to be if you can have a West Wing where you, Mrs. Danvers, can preserve the life of the former Mrs. De Winter. One thing that I noticed is the electric light switch. The detail created by Du Maurier is really quite compelling. It says at the end of the second paragraph, my first impression was one of shock because the room was fully furnished as though in use. Pay attention to, because Mrs. Danvers kind of lurks there, and as if she wants to be immersed in the presence of Rebecca, who's still dead. The flowers, too, are, she says, there are flowers on the dressing table and on the table beside the bed. Flowers, too, on the carved mantelpiece. So, flowers, I've already told you about the rhododendrons being red and blood red and such creepy metaphors and descriptors. On the next page, 168, in the middle of that incomplete paragraph, it was not used. It was not lived in anymore. Even the flowers could not destroy the musty smell. And she reiterates, Rebecca was dead. But the eye speaker can hear the sea very plainly. And I hope you're noticing as you go along how prominent a place the sea plays in everybody's attention. We know that so far we know that Rebecca seems to have drowned in the sea, and she says I could hear the sound of the sea very plainly, and then she says towards the bottom of page 168, I was a guest again, an uninvited guest. I had strolled into my hostess's bedroom by mistake. So creepy. And then at the top of page 169, it's actually at the end of the end of the incomplete paragraph. Often you forget to use the other, and when they are taken to be washed, there was one that was still quite clean and untouched. How white and thin my face looked in the glass, my hair hanging lank and straight. Did I always look like this? Surely I had more color as a rule. The reflection stared back at me, sallow and plain. Pay attention to facial expressions. I think I've mentioned this before. The eye speaker can read quite a bit in her husband's face by his expressions. And here, this poor woman seems to be getting thinner and plainer and more sallow. Next paragraph, second or third sentence, I was aware of a growing sense of horror turning to despair. A few lines later, it was cold, quite cold, but there was a dim mustiness about it still where the scent had been. And then at the end of that complete paragraph, she says, I noticed with a sick, dull aching in my heart that there were creases in the nightdress, and the texture was ruffled. It had not been touched or laundered since it was last worn. Ew. But it gives you this feeling of creepiness. Next page. At the top, 170, the wardrobe smelt stuffy and queer. The azalea scent, so fragrant and delicate in the air, had turned stale inside the wardrobe, tarnishing the silver dresses and brocade, and the breath of it wafted towards me now from the open doors, faded and old. Remember that when the eye speaker pulled a hanky out of the mackintosh that was given to her to wear, the hanky smelled like azaleas, and the azaleas, of course, that's the smell of Rebecca, and it's still here. At the top of page 171, She took hold of my arm. Here's Mrs. Danvers. Oh, she's found the eye speaker in the West Wing. She took hold of my arm and walked me towards the bed. I could not resist her. I was like a dumb thing. The touch of her hand made me shudder, and her voice was low and intimate, a voice I hated and feared. She's got hold of her by her arm, and she's moving her, and she's talking to her in that voice that the eye speaker so fears. Next paragraph. This was her bed, says Mrs. Danvers. It is a beautiful bed, isn't it? I keep the golden coverlet on it always. It was her favorite. Here is her nightdress inside the case. You've been touching it, haven't you? This just gives you the heebie-jeebies. This whole paragraph is full of creepy detail. Um, These are her slippers. Throw me my slips, Danny, she used to say. She had little feet for her height. Put your hands inside the slippers. They are quite small and narrow, aren't they? There's something so dark about Mrs. Danvers' obsession with Rebecca. She forced the slippers over my hands, smiling all the while, watching my eyes. Next paragraph. She put the slippers back on the floor and laid the dressing gown on the chair. You've seen her brushes, haven't you? She said, taking me to the dressing table. There they are, just as she used them, unwashed and untouched. Mrs. Danvers is highly passive-aggressive here, but there's something to be noticed in these brushes. Remember that Maxime has purchased for the current Mrs. De Winter a new set of brushes, and surely we are meant to make that connection. Next page. At the bottom of page 172, Mrs. Danvers says, the scent is still fresh, isn't it? You can almost imagine. She had only just taken it off. I would always know when she had been before me in a room. There would be a little whiff of her scent in the room of the azalea. At the top of page 173, um, there's a terrible visual here. It actually is at the bottom of page 172. These are her underclothes in this drawer. This pink set here she had never worn. She was wearing slacks, of course, and a shirt when she died. They were torn from her body in the water, though there was nothing on her body when it was found, all those weeks afterwards. Such a visual. Next paragraph. Her fingers tightened on my arm. You could almost see her gritting her teeth. She bent down to me, her skull's face close. Her face is always described that way. White skull's face. Reminiscent of the dead Rebecca. Her eyes searching mine. The rocks had battered her to bits, you know, she whispered. Her beautiful face unrecognizable and both arms gone. Mr. De Winter identified her. He went to Edgecombe to do it. He went quite alone. So I have another note to myself here about Mrs. Danvers. Is Mrs. Danvers, the question is, dead or alive? Her face is always described as a white skull's face. Let's see. And then weirdly, at one point, the current Mrs. De Winter notices that she has little patches of yellow beneath her ears. I'm not absolutely sure what that is. I don't think anybody really could piece that together. It's probably just another, this author says it's another gruesome touch to make sure we associate Mrs. Danvers with death and decay. That could be it. We imagine her as recently removed from a grave and living and carrying out afterworldly will of her powerful mistress. So you can't even imagine that Mrs. Danvers is anything but not a reincarnation, that's not the right word, a an offshoot say that, of Rebecca. It makes us understand that Mrs. Danvers' own identity is so intertwined with Rebecca that she practically dies with her. She only becomes animated or lifelike when she's talking about Rebecca. Watch that. Um, and then in the next paragraph, I'm on page 173. My arm was bruised and numb from the presence of her fingers. How hard was she squeezing? It would take quite a bit of force for me to bruise my own arm with my own fingers. So she was really squeezing her arm hard. I could see how tightly the skin was stretched across her face, showing the cheekbones. There were little patches of yellow beneath her ears. So there's that reference. And it might be that Mrs. Danvers is so close, so literally in the eye speaker's face that the eye speaker can see underneath her ears. You can hear Daphne. The toys come back. Mrs. Danvers gives us some more insight down at the bottom of the page. Let's see. She talks about she's spending the night down at the cottage, I expect. Remember the little cottage? That's along the shore, um, touching the sea. And there's something weird about how Rebecca spends the night in the cottage, but we only get little bits of insight. After all, she spent many nights at the cottage and had sailed in every sort of weather. Um, that's an interesting idea too, because the sea, remember, is neither malevolent nor benevolent, and it does take Rebecca's life, so far as we know. At the end of, I'm on page 174, Mrs. Danvers loosened the pressure on my arm. Her hand fell back again to her side. Her voice lost all expression, became the hard mechanical voice of every day. All these other paragraphs, she's animated because she's talking about Rebecca. Next couple paragraphs, she said why Mr. De Winter does not use these rooms anymore. Listen to the sea. Even with the windows closed and the shutters fastened, I could hear it, a low, sullen murmur as the waves broke on the white shingle in the cove. The tide would be coming in fast now and running up the beach nearly to the stone cottage. The eye speaker says at the bottom of 174, I too could see the ash on the floor beside the chair. I too could hear his footsteps. And I too, 1, 2, backwards and forwards. Mrs. Danvers says that she sees Maxime, especially right after Rebecca died, pacing in his room. Pacing, pacing, pacing. The weird thing is that Mrs. Danvers apparently has been looking through the crack. Of course, if she's looking in on Maxime shortly after Rebecca died, she's probably looking in on the eye speaker as well. She says, no one ever comes here but me, but I'll happily show you around. You can almost see her gritting her teeth. Her manner was fawning again, intimate and unpleasant. Notice her facial expression. The smile on her face was false, an unnatural thing. Next paragraph, I'm on page 175. It's not only this room, she said. It's in many rooms in the house, in the morning room, in the hall, even in the little flower room. I feel her everywhere. You do too, don't you? Well, if the eye speaker didn't feel her in every room, now she does. So there's something almost ghostly in the next paragraph. Mrs. Danvers went on looking at me, watching my eyes. Do you think she can see us? Talking to one another now, she said slowly. Do you think the dead come back and watch the living? Dang. Isn't that? It's horrifying. At the top of page 176. Sometimes I wonder, she whispered. Sometimes I wonder if she comes back here to Manderley and watches you and Mr. De Winter together. Well, if you put that into her head, it stays. It would stay in my head. We stood there by the door, staring at one another. I could not take my eyes from her. How dark and somber they were in that white skull's face of hers. How malevolent, how full of hatred. Also the face. Next paragraph, or next chapter. Phone's ringing. Turn it off. Okay. One thing you should be noticing is that Maxime is very distant. Rebecca has said many times so far, and will continue to say, how much she loves Maxime, but he never says that to her. And he's very cold. At the top, um, at the top of the first paragraph in chapter 15, Maxime rang up the next morning to say he would be back about 7. Frith took the message. Maxime did not ask to speak to me himself. That's really cold. Next paragraph, well, in the big paragraph at the bottom of page 177, you can hear the anxiety. Remember that anxiety is one of the characteristics of the Gothic, the anxiety of the character. And we saw that in Jane Eyre, or we saw that in the Yellow Wallpaper, and also in The Telltale Heart. She says in the next paragraph, I had slept badly, perhaps because I was alone in the room. I had been restless. Well, of course she slept badly. She's got creepy Mrs. Danvers hanging around. I had been restless, waking up often, and when I glanced at my clock, I saw the hands had scarcely moved. When I did fall asleep, I had varied wandering dreams. She says, I could not. Oh, here's a dream she has. We were walking through the woods, and Maxime and I, and he was always just a little ahead of me. I could not keep up with him. I starred that in my book, because she can't keep up with him, and she's very aware of that. Socially, intellectually, she can't keep up with Rebecca either. So if we go, let's see, the next page. 178. Down towards the bottom, I tried to concentrate on the bald newspaper columns, and later to lose myself in the racy plot of the novel in my hands. I did not want to think of yesterday afternoon and Mrs. Danvers. I tried to forget that she was in the house at this moment, perhaps looking down on me from one of the windows. And now and again, when I looked up from my book or glanced across the garden, I had the feeling I was not alone. Du Maurier is very clever in dropping these little hints at us. Is it Mrs. Danvers who's watching her? But now Mrs. Danvers has laid the seed. Perhaps it's Rebecca. We haven't seen any ghosts. So far there's no ghosts, but poor I speaker thinks she's not alone. At the top of page 179, there's a reference to these games. I remembered a game I had played as a child that my friends next door had called Grandmother Steps, or myself, Old Witch. I had to look that up. I didn't know what that game was. But when I was a kid, we played a game called Red Rover. And it's this exact same game. Red Rover, have someone come over, and then everybody just quick darts up there, and you try to touch the person who's the it girl, and it's the same game. She says this bold player would pounce upon you from behind, unheralded, unseen, with a scream of triumph. I felt as tense and expectant as I did then. I was playing Old Witch with Mrs. Danvers. Isn't that a fabulous metaphor? Because you can, if you ever played that game when you were a little, if your kids played that game, you would be really tense waiting for somebody to come up and poke you on the back. So let's see, we get Beatrice. Beatrice is an interesting character. I don't think I have any notes about Beatrice. But Beatrice clearly tries to be helpful, to I don't have any notes on Beatrice. She's trying to be a friend to the eye speaker. She says, and she's kind of blunt, but at least you get the truth from her. She says, "You don't look well." Okay, that is the second time today that we have seen somebody say that the eye speaker doesn't seem to be well. It seems to be getting thinner. And remember, last week I told you that the further she and Maxime get from Italy, the less well both of them seem to be. Next page. Oh, I thought this was funny. This gives you a really good picture of Beatrice down at the bottom of page 180. The car sped along. She kept her foot permanently on the accelerator. I thought that was hilarious. And took every corner at an acute angle. Two motors we passed looked out of their windows, outraged as she swept by. And one pedestrian in a lane waved his stick at her. I felt rather hot for her. She did not seem to notice, though. I crouched lower in my seat. That's an early example of road rage. That's hilarious. And then at the bottom of page 180, I'm sure you have been in cars with people who say things like this. What on earth does this car in front think it's doing? Why don't you put out your hand, my good man? Really, some of these people on the road today ought to be shot. I think that's hilarious because they that's Beatrice. She's one of those fairly aggressive drivers. And she asks her, "You do play bridge, don't you?" Remember, there are repeated references, and poor eye speaker. She doesn't play bridge. She doesn't ride horses. She doesn't hunt, establishing her place in the class order. Towards the bottom of page 181, I saw them all rocking from side to side in Beatrice's drawing room. All these friends who knew one another so well, establishing eye speaker as an outsider. At the bottom, she said, they're talking about playing charades at Christmas. I had an uneasy feeling we might be asked to spend the approaching Christmas with Beatrice. Perhaps I could have influenza. Have you ever thought of that? You don't want to go somewhere? I've got a headache. I have the flu. I think that's telling detail. Let's see, at the bottom, and then on page 182, there's a reference to Jack Favo. Favo. I think it's Favo. And Beatrice says of him, he's an awful bounder. And a bounder is somebody who's dishonorable. And that's Beatrice. Now remember, we've just established that Beatrice she tells the truth. And she says this guy's a bounder. And she also says, I rather think he was Rebecca's cousin, which seems like an oxymoron to the eye speaker because Rebecca seems to have all the skills, the organization, the beauty, the personality, and this Fable guy's kind of a creep. If we look at the top of page 183, I could tell in a glance it was the sort of house that was aggressively well kept by a big staff, and all for one old lady who was nearly blind. She and Beatrice have gone to visit Beatrice and Maxime's grandmother, who's an old lady. And I think the scene is here to again point out how much of an outsider the eye speaker is. She's sitting in a bath chair. I had to look that up. I didn't know what a bath chair was. But I think it's a chair that holds and supports somebody who's perhaps a little bit weakened. She sits in a wet bath chair. That was what Maxime would look like if he was very old, if he was blind. Just put a star on that. We'll come back to that. The nurse by her side got up from her chair and put a mark in the book she was reading. I love that. She's putting a bookmark in. I just really liked the detail. And then she gets up. If we look over on page 184, the nurse is knitting. The nurse brought out some knitting and clicked her needle sharply. And then a few lines later, "It's a beautiful spot, isn't it?" she said, the needles jabbing one another. I just liked the language. Right in the middle of the page, I wondered whether she used we in the royal sense or if she meant that Maxine's grandmother and herself were one. I think that's a telling detail because that is the observation that the eye speaker makes. And that's the impression that we are getting of Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. Just a little bit of an underscore there. Beatrice, remember Beatrice gave her gave the eye speaker those art books, not really having a full understanding of the eye speaker's interest in art. Apparently, it's really just a passive interest in drawing, but Beatrice kind of misses the point. Mrs. De Winter is very keen on art. She says, again, the nurse has a fury of her knitting. That's a third reference to the angry knitting needles. I bet you didn't know we had an artist in the family, and the grandmother misunderstands. Of course, she's partially blind, or nearly so, and doesn't really understand that this young woman is now Mrs. De Winter, and she asks rather harshly, "Where is Rebecca?" But we look at the top of page 186. I felt rather exhausted and wondered, rather shocked at my callous thought, why old people are sometimes such a strain, worse than young children or puppies, because one had to be polite. She's just thinking this to herself. Mid-page on 186, she had to live here in this bright red-gabled house with the nurse until it was time for her to die. I thought how little we know about the feelings of old people. Children we understand, their fears and hopes and make-believe. I was a child yesterday. I had not forgotten, but Maxine's grandmother, sitting there in her shawl with her poor blind eyes, what did she feel? What was she thinking? We are participating in this interior monologue with the eye speaker. These are her thoughts about the grandmother. Page 187. "It's only just turned the half hour, madam," said Nora in a special voice, bright and cheerful like the nurse. I wondered if Maxime's grandmother realized that people spoke to her in this way. I wondered when they had done so for the first time, and if she had noticed then. Perhaps she had said to herself, "They think I'm getting old. How very ridiculous." And then by little, she became accustomed to it. Now it was as though they had always done so, and it was part of her background. But the young woman with the chestnut hair and the narrow waist, who gave sugar to the horses, where was she? So as I said on the previous page, we are participating, we are seeing this interior monologue of the eye speaker, and it gradually takes the path of remembering Rebecca. Page 188, towards the bottom of the page. B, who is this child? She's talking to her daughter. The grandmother's talking to her daughter, Beatrice. Why did not Maxine bring Rebecca? I'm so fond of Rebecca. Where is dear Rebecca? Oh, can you imagine? The eye speaker cannot get away from Rebecca. Rebecca is pervasive. Top of 189. Where is Rebecca? Why did not Maxine come and bring Rebecca? Replied the thin, tired, querulous voice. I had forgotten she was so fond of Rebecca, said Beatrice at the bottom of this page. Rebecca made a great fuss of her, always. And we get a little bit more insight into Rebecca at the top of page 190. Poor darling Gran was much more alert then. She used to rock with laughter at whatever Rebecca said. Of course, she was always very amusing, and the old lady loved that. She had an amazing gift, Rebecca, of being attractive to people, men, women, children, dogs. I suppose the old lady has never forgotten her. My dear, you won't thank me for this afternoon. So Beatrice feels in some ways as if she has set the eye speaker up by taking her to see the grandma, because the grandma doesn't realize that there's no Rebecca anymore. If we look over on page 191 at the end of that first bigger paragraph at the top, Maxine's grandmother had bowed her head to avoid the sweeping branches of the trees, and the horse had trotted down the twisting drive where I now walked. The drive had been wider and smoother too, better kept. The woods did not encroach upon it. So again, the eye speaker travels a little bit back into the consciousness of the grandmother and what the road to Manderley had been and what it is now. We see that too in the next paragraph. I did not think of her as she was now, lying against those pillows with that shawl around her. I saw her when she was young and when Manderley was her home. So she's talking about, she's created this picture, this memory in her own head about what the grandmother's life must have been when the grandmother was young. At the end of page 191, someone tall and slim and very beautiful who had a gift, Beatrice said, of being attractive to people. Easy to like, I suppose, easy to love. That's Beatrice telling the eye speaker about Rebecca. And the result is that the eye speaker feels as if she can't compete. She is nothing by comparison. At the top of 192, we see she looks up and sees Mrs. Danvers came out of the library, shutting the door behind her. I crouched against the wall of the gallery so that I should not be seen. I had caught one glimpse of her face. It was gray with anger, distorted and horrible. Can you imagine how pathetic this poor thing is, where she has to hide from the housekeeper? But notice the facial expression. Always. And I think this is something that the eye speaker can read well, people's facial expressions. Mid-page, I could tell in a glance that something had made him very angry, as she's talking about her husband now. His mouth was hard, his nostrils white and pinched. Maxime reveals quite a bit about himself in his facial expressions. We'll see that in a minute. Next chapter. Let's see. Notice the language, the negative language in that first paragraph. It was one Sunday, I remember, when we had an invasion of visitors. Remember, she's so pathetically shy that she hates when these people come and visit. She feels like she just can't keep up. Next sentence or so, we heard the fatal sound of a car rounding the sweep in the drive. It was too late to warn Frith. Very negative language. Next paragraph. We found ourselves with a piece stripped from our day, entertaining group after group of dreary acquaintances. She talks about the tea, and it's in the drawing room. She loathed it. On the top of page 195, here we have a very awkward tea. Americans don't really have tea. You might have a snack, but tea was kind of a ritual. It probably still is. So here's a couple paragraphs of this awkward tea. Oh, Mr. De Winter, she said, there is something I've been wanting to ask you for ages. Now tell me, is there any chance of you reviving the Manderley Fancy Dress Ball? Uh-oh. Next paragraph. Maxine says, well, I don't know, said Maxine dryly. It was rather a business to organize. You had better ask Frank Crawley. He'd have to do it. I felt bad about that because he doesn't turn to his wife and say she should do it. Frank has to manage this, thinking, of course, that this poor eye speaker is not capable. And next paragraph, one of the guests says, we all miss the Manderley gaiety. I heard Frank's quiet voice behind me. I don't mind organizing the ball if Maxime has no objection to giving it. It's up to him and Mrs. Winter. Frank is a friend to her. and he helps her through some of these awkward states. But notice that he includes her in that decision, something that Maxime doesn't do. Next page, 196 at the bottom. Maxine still watched me doubtfully over the teapot. It occurred to me that perhaps he thought I could not face it, that being shy, as he knew only too well, I should find myself unable to cope. I did not want him to think that. She's trying, but if you've ever been in an awkward situation, you would just dread something like this. At the top of 197, Maxine was throwing sticks for Jasper on the lawn. I wondered if it was the same in every home, this feeling of exuberance when visitors had gone. Have you ever felt like that? When people come and stay with you, bring all their luggage and throw it down on the floor, and then they stay with you forever. And by the time it's time for them to go, you're helping them out the door. That's what she feels. I thought that was funny. Um, At the bottom of page 197, I'm not a bride, I said. I did not even have a proper wedding. No white dress or orange blossoms or trailing bridesmaids. I don't want any silly dance given in my honor. Poor thing. I mean, she didn't. That and the reference to the white dress, that's going to come back to us. Maxime says in the middle of page 198, Lady Crawin is a damn nuisance, Maxime said. If she had to write out all the invitations and organize the affairs, she would not be so enthusiastic. Picture the current eye speaker sitting at the little desk in the garden room with all the little pigeonholes with the stationery that used to be Rebecca's. She's fully humiliated at the bottom of page. The eye speaker is humiliated. Mrs. De Winter need not bother her head about anything at all at the bottom of this page, but it rather added to my sense of humility to feel that I was not even capable of licking the stamps. I really thought about her Du Maurier's use of the word humility. Sorry, I think in this case it's really synonymous with her humiliation. She's humiliated. She's not even allowed to lick the stamps. At the top of page 199, I'll give you and Frank the surprise of your lives. You won't know me. That's her. And she made many statements like this. Mid-paragraph, 199, or mid-page. I wished he would not always treat me like a child, rather spoilt, rather irresponsible, someone to be petted from time to time when the mood came upon him, but more often forgotten, more often patted on the shoulder and told to run away and play. That's all the language that Maxine has used. I wish something would happen to make me look wiser, more mature. And then she asks her a bunch of questions. Was it always going to be like this? He away ahead of me with his own moods. Remember the dream? He was always ahead of her. His moods that I did not share, his secret troubles that I did not know. Would we never be together, he a man and I a woman, standing shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, with no gulf between us? Notice those questions. The I speaker asks questions frequently. I did not want to be a child. I wanted to be his wife, his mother. I wanted to be old. I wondered for the 20th time that day whether it was by Maxime's order that those rooms in the West Wing were kept furnished and untouched. She doesn't know if it's missing. Why are those rooms kept like that? Rebecca's dead. Next page. At the about a quarter of the way down the page. I haven't made up my mind, Clarice, I said, but I tell you what, when I do decide, I shall tell you and nobody else. It will be a dead secret between us both. Notice the language. At the bottom of page 200. Preparation went on for the ball. Everything seemed to be done at the estate office. Maxime and Frank were down there every morning. As Frank had said, I did not have to bother my head about anything. I don't think I licked one stamp. I began to get in a panic about my costume. I keep thinking, too, that Maxime always kisses her on the top of her head, which is how you kiss a child. There. Top of page 201. But at the end of the first complete paragraph, all the waste paper baskets are always brought to me to check at the end of the day. This is Mrs. Danvers. And apparently, everybody is supposed to bring the garbage cans to her at the end of the day so she can check them. I thought that was creepy. At the bottom of page 201, there was a hint of derision in her voice, a trace of odd satisfaction. And a little bit later, she continued watching me, her hand on the doorknob. I wonder you don't copy one of the pictures in the gallery. Star that, because Mrs. Danvers is laying a trap. If you've gotten further along, you know the trap she's laid. Top of page 202. All the pictures in the gallery would make good costumes, said Mrs. Danvers, especially that one of the young lady in white with her hat in her hand. Remember that the eye speaker just said she didn't even have a white dress. So Mrs. Danvers is laying this trap for her. Maybe you should recreate that costume. Mm-hmm. Know about this white dress. I think I have something about it. We're going to see her. So many references here. Okay, we'll get to the white dress in a second. So she says, why don't you have your dress made in London? And at the top of page 203, and I could not connect him with my idea of Rebecca. Rebecca, with her beauty, her charm, her breeding, why did she have a cousin like Jack Bobble? It was wrong, out of proportion. Something's not right there. She thinks he's strange. But she creates kind of a, you know how she does this? She's going along and she creates these stories in her head to try to explain things to herself. She does that in the middle of page 203. As I sat down to dinner in the dining room in my accustomed place with Maxine at the head of the table, I pictured Rebecca sitting where I sat now, picking up her fork for the fish, and then the telephone ringing and Frith coming into the room saying, Mr. Fauble on the phone, madam, wishing to speak to you. And Rebecca would get up from her chair with a quick glance at Maxime, who would not say anything, who would go on eating his fish. And this is just a scenario in her head to try to understand how Fauble fits in. At the bottom of page 203, I had so identified myself with Rebecca that my own dull self did not exist, had never come to Manderley. I had gone back in thought and in person to the days that were gone. And Maxine is watching her almost take on the persona of Rebecca and says that they are antics at the top of page 204 and a few lines down from the bottom. But what goes on in the twisted, torturous minds of women would baffle anyone. So he's, again, that's just a little insight into Maxine's vision of women, and we presume into the eye speaker. But it should make us wonder if that's the way he perceived Rebecca. Top of page 205. I don't want you to look like you did just now. You had a twist to your mouth and a flash of knowledge in your eyes. Not the right sort of knowledge. Something she almost in her taking on the persona of Rebecca, she took on some sort of dark facial expression that reminded Maxine perhaps of a different face. I felt very curious, rather excited. What do you mean, Maxine? What isn't the right sort of knowledge? At the end of the next paragraph, a moment ago, when you were going through that curious little performance, the antics, right? The expression was gone. Something else had taken its place. A few lines later, there is a certain type of knowledge I prefer you not to have. What is that knowledge? Perhaps it's the fortunate fall. I think that's what the reference is. You get a certain kind of knowledge, and at that moment, you know something that you didn't know before, but it damages your innocence. And then she says, I wish you would not treat me as if I was 6. That's what it does. Bottom of page 205. No, you're not. I can tell by your eyes. You're playing with me all the time, just as if I was a silly little girl. She's trying, but that is in fact how he treats her. Top of page 206. I warn you, you'll get the surprise of your life when you do see me in my fancy dress. She says it many times. So she looks at this girl painting, and it is a Rayburn, and it is a portrait of Caroline de Winter. Now, Rayburn was a real painter, but I don't think that he painted this particular portrait that looks like this. He was a portraiteur, a painter, and he was known for his very astute observations of reality. He could capture, and this is perhaps why he was popular, he could capture people's facial expressions in this. So he's the painter of the picture of Caroline de Winter that the eye speaker is now going to copy for her dress. Top of page two, or middle of page 207. Um, he wore an harassed expression like someone who has got to catch a train. The dogs were miserable. Jasper trailed about the hall with his tail between his legs and nipped every workman on sight. He used to stand on the terrace barking idiotically and then dash madly to one of the corners of the lawn and eat grass in a sort of frenzy. I just underline that because that's what dogs do when they don't know what's going on. And this is amidst all of the preparations for the ball. And poor Jasper can't, he's not understanding it. But he's eating grass in a sort of frenzy in the corner, the poor little thing. Let's see. At the top of page 208, the great day of the ball dawned, misty and overcast. But then the mist clears, and it is a beautiful day. Mrs. Danvers showed herself at last, quietly, calmly. She told the gardeners where to put the flowers, and she herself arranged them, stacking the vases with quick, deft flowers. Well, there's something strange about flower arranging. I lost my. Um, Flower arranging is an interesting point because here's Mrs. Danvers beautifully arranging flowers from the garden. But flowers that are arranged are flowers that are going to die. And remember, early in the novel, Maxime said he didn't allow flowers to be brought into the house, except for maybe roses, which were cultivated by his mother. Those are the only ones he allowed. All the rest of them he wouldn't allow to be cut because they're on the verge of death. Now remember, this is Mrs. Danvers, who is um, death-like. Mid-page 208, Maxime and I had lunch with Frank at his bachelor establishment next door to the office to be out of the way. We were three in the rather hearty, cheerful humor of people before a funeral. Isn't that a strange reference? And I guess there's some truth to it, because if you're anticipating something really negative, as she is, she's not enjoying this ball preparation at all. I just thought that was an odd reference. Next paragraph or next sentence. I felt very much the same as I did the morning I was married, the same stifled feeling that I had gone too far now to turn back. At the bottom of the page, she says, "You won't know me," I told them. "You will both get the shock of your lives." Down at the bottom, "You are not going to dress up as a clown, are you?" said Maxime gloomily. "No frightful attempt to be funny." Well, he's about to get the shock of his life. Um, Over on page 210. The afternoon dragged like the last hour before a journey when one is packed and keyed to departure. I just like the comparison. It was really, it's quite good. And I think that's why Du Maurier was so well why people read her novels so much, because the language is so fabulous. Um, at the bottom of page 210, yes, Maxine said, I don't think anything has been altered. Has it, Frank? We had all the records down at the office. Nothing has been forgotten, and I don't think we left anyone out. So this is essentially the same ball that Rebecca would have created, and the I speaker is left out. Top of 211. No, my dear boy, the organization is too good, but I do think the host ought to give the lead himself. I think it's quite enough if the hostess makes the effort. So, who's he talking about if the hostess makes the effort? It's kind of vague. This Mrs. Winters? Mrs. De Winters? Top of page 212. This is probably the fifth time she said this. I've promised to give him the surprise of his life. At the bottom of 212, Mrs. De Winter says we shan't know her. The dance was being given for me in my honor because I was the bride. Wearing white. It was new, this sudden unexpected sensation of being important, talking about my dress. The anticipation is really building here. 213 at the bottom. The old austerity had gone. Manderley had come alive in a fashion I had not have believed possible. It was not the still, quiet Manderley I knew. There was a certain significance about it now that had not been before. A reckless air, rather triumphant, rather pleasing. It was as if the house remembered other days long ago. So, um, she examines the history of Manderley at the top of page 214. Um, we've seen quite a bit of that, but in the middle of page 214, ladies, you are going to think this is hilarious. What about under the left shoulder there? I said anxiously. That strap of mine, is it going to show? It's got to be a bra strap. You know how you always reach in and yank it up? Fabulous detail. She says, I felt different already, no longer hampered by my appearance. My own dull personality was submerged at last as she's putting on this outfit. Oh, Clarice, I said, what will Mr. De Winter say? Oh my God, the anticipation is building. Page 215. Um, the curl stood away from the head in a little cloud. I watched this self that was not me at all, then smiled a new, slow smile. If you have gotten to what's going to happen in the next couple of pages, that really is true. She becomes something other than herself. So now they are all standing um, at the bottom of the stairs, and on page 216, the band is already in place. And she says, make the drummer announce me. Make him beat the drum. You know how they do. Then call out, Miss Caroline De Winter. The top of page 215. How do you do, Mr. De Winter? Maxine had not moved. He stared up at me, his glass in his hand. There was no color in his face. It was ashen white. No facial expression. I saw Frank go to him as though he would speak, but Maxine shook him off. I hesitated, one foot already on the stairs. Something was wrong. They had not understood. Why was Maxine looking like that? Why did they all stand like dummies, like people in a trance? Next paragraph. What the hell do you think you are doing? He said. His eyes blazed in anger. His face was still ashen white. Um, yeah, 3 times on this page, he's described as having an ashen white face. When Maxine spoke again, I did not recognize his voice. It was still and quiet, icy cold, not a voice I knew. Remember that Beatrice had told the eye speaker that about twice a year Maxine loses his temper, and we think he's really going to blow his top right here. I could not speak. I went on staring at him. His eyes were the only living things in the white mask of his face. That's reminiscent of Mrs. Danvers, too. Everybody turns white At the bottom of this page, the corridor was deserted. I looked about me, stunned and stupid like a hunted thing. I saw that the door leading to the west wing was open wide and that someone was standing there. It was Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face, loathsome and triumphant, the face of an exulting devil. She stood there, smiling at me. She set her up. This was the dress, this was the picture that Rebecca had copied. And Mrs. Danvers put the idea in the eye speaker's face. It's just so mean. So Beatrice, next chapter, attempts to help the eye speaker. In the middle of page 220, why the dress, you poor dear, the picture you copied of the girl in the gallery. It was what Rebecca did at the last fancy dress ball at Manderley. Identical. The same picture, the same dress. You stood there on the stairs for one ghastly moment. I thought, and we know what she thought, that Rebecca had come back, or that this was the ghost of Rebecca. So sinister. Bottom of page 220. He thinks, you see, it was deliberate on your part. You had some bet that you would startle him, didn't you? Some foolish joke, and of course he doesn't understand. It was such a frightful shock for him. I told him at once that you could not have done such a thing, and that it was sheer appalling luck that you chose that particular picture. It was Mrs. Danvers. 221. I ought to have known, I repeated again. It was my fault. I ought to have known. I ought to have known. In other words, she's thinking back at how Mrs. Danvers had laid this little trap for her. Page 221, mid-page. But nobody will know about the dress, she said. Frank and Giles will never breathe a word. We've got the story all arranged. The shop sent the wrong dress. She's just thinking up a plot so that the eye speaker can manage her dignity. It was just the first shock, Beatrice said. It was shocking. Next page, bottom of page 222. There's some nice detail. He half glanced in my direction again, sympathetic but rather curious, wondering why I sat there on the bed, and his voice was low, as it might be after an accident when people are waiting for the doctor. Details just so right on. 2 paragraphs later, he obeyed her, shuffling away in his Arabian robes. This is the sort of moment I thought that I shall laugh at years afterwards, that I shall say, do you remember how Giles was dressed as an Arab, and Beatrice had a veil over her face, and jangling bangles on her wrist, and time will mellow it, make it a moment for laughter. But now it was not funny. Now I did not laugh. It was not the future. It was the present. And we see the eye speaker playing with time here. She wants it to be in the future so that she can let go of the nightmare that she has just created. Top of page 223, in the middle of that bigger paragraph at the top, she rustled out of the room, closing the door behind her. I felt I had forfeited her sympathy by my refusal to go down. I had shown the white feather. I didn't know what that meant, so I looked it up. If you Google it, it says cowardice. And that's what she thinks. She had not understood. She belonged to another breed of men and women, another race than I. They had guts, the women of her race. They were not like me. End of the paragraph. I could not do that. I had not the pride. I had not the guts. I was badly bred. We see her self-deprecating all the time. So here she is. She's in this room. It's her room. She has refused to go downstairs, and she got up from my bed and went and looked out of the window. That's an image for people looking for something. The gardeners were going through the lights in the rose garden. And the rose garden, again, was the one that was cultivated by Maxime's mother. At the top of page 224, she compares herself badly. This new one's, and this is a story in her head. This is what she envisions people saying about her, "This new one's not like our Mrs. De Winter. She's different altogether." And a woman next to them in the crowd would agree, and other people too, all saying, "That's right, that's right. She's not." And the women would turn to their neighbors, nodding mysteriously. She imagines the gossip, and it's that makes her eventually put on the blue dress from the wardrobe and go down. Why, that there's nothing wrong with her at all. They've had a colossal row, and she wouldn't appear. That's what de- determines her, or what makes her decide to go down the top of 225. Of course, I've heard before the marriage is not a wild success. She tries really hard not to fail in this marriage. Several people have said so. They say he's beginning to realize he's made a big mistake. No, I've heard there's nothing much to her. Who was she? Oh, no one at all. Some pick up in the south of France, a nursery governess or something. And when you think of Rebecca, she can't bear gossip. So she irons her dress, puts it on. She said the iron was one of those universal kinds that go on any voltage, and I fitted it to the plug in the wall. If you've ever been to Europe, you often bring those plug adapters. They never work though. They always short out whatever appliance you have. Um, so she puts on her dress and she says at the bottom of page 225, "I might have been my old self again, going down to the lounge of the hotel with Mrs. Van Hopper." So putting on the white dress before, she was able to put on a different self. And now she's becoming her old self. At the top of page 226, um, "I shall never forget her, dressed all in white with that cloud of dark hair. I ought to have remembered that. I ought to have known." There are crumbs of detail about Rebecca told to the speaker, and they come back to her now. And it reminds her that she should have heard what other people were saying, but she's in such a vacuum. Um, at the top of page 227, "I walk slowly down the stairs to meet them." And now she shifts to the present. "When I look back at my first party at Mandoline, my first and my last, I can remember little isolated things standing alone out of the vast blank canvas of the evening." So now it's become retrospective. "The background was hazy, a sea of dim faces, none of whom I knew, and there was a slow drone of the band harping out a waltz that never finished, that went on and on. The same couples swung by in a rotation with the same fixed smiles, and to me, standing with Maxime at the bottom of the stairs to welcome the latecomers, these dancing couples seemed like marionettes, twisting and turning on a piece of string held by some invisible thread." And then she talks about these women as they come around over and over and over. Um, and now she says at the bottom of page 227, there was Lady Crowan, too monstrous in purple, disguised as I know not what romantic figure of the past. It may have been Marie Antoinette or Nell Gwynn, for all I knew. Well, now, Nell Gwynn, I had to look that one up too. She's the famous mistress of Charles II, a strange erotic combination of the two. Top of page 228. "I wanted to go to Robert and stand beside him and say, 'I know how you feel. I understand. I've done worse than you tonight.' I can feel now the stiff, set smile on my face that did not match the misery in my eyes. I can see Beatrice and Giles." And then in her memory, she says at the end of this paragraph, "I blessed him for his pathetic, simple gesture of understanding and sincerity." That's Giles. So Du Maurier is trying to establish some of these sympathetic characters Poor dear Frank at the bottom of 228. I never asked, I never knew how much he hated the last fancy dress ball ever given at Manderley. Top of 229. The band played on, the swaying couples twisted like bobbing marionettes. Second reference to marionettes, like they have just no will. They go around and around. Um, the figure who stood beside it was wooden too. His face was a mask. His smile was not his own. The eyes were not the eyes of the man I loved, the man I knew. They looked through me and beyond me, cold, expressionless, to some place of pain and torture I could not enter, to some private inward hell I could not share. So that is hinting at Maxime's history. And we don't know what it is yet. He never spoke to me. He never touched me. We stood beside one another, the host and the hostess, and we were not together. She's so alone, and she's got this smile plastered on her face, and yet they are separated by this incident with the dress. Um, there's a little paragraph in which the sailor, one of the dressed up people, I tell you what, said the sailor, turning to me, you ought to say that you are forget-me-not. And of course, the forget-me-nots are symbolic of fidelity. It's a forget-me-not. And I don't know, I have some in my yard. They're these teeny tiny little blue flowers. They're quite beautiful. And they are, he's the sailor, costumed guest, is telling the eye speaker that she looks like a forget-me-not. And the forget-me-nots are symbols of fidelity and true love and respect. So he has given her this meaning. At the top of, oh no, at the bottom of page 230, again, an examination of time. I'm not overly certain why Daphne is standing here whining at me. What was the time I did not know? The evening dragged on, hour after hour, the same faces, the same tunes. And Beatrice says to her, why don't you sit down? You look like death. I wish she'd quit making so much noise. So there are fireworks at the end of the evening. And the detail of people watching the fireworks is just so true. The slow hiss of the rocket as it sped into the air, the burst of the explosion, the stream of little emerald stars, a murmur of approval from the crowd, cries of delight and applause. I think that's just so, the details just so good. The salmon lady well to the front, her face eager with expectation. A remark for every star that fell. Oh, what a beauty. Look at that one now. Haven't you ever? I've sat in crowds like that, watching the fireworks, and it lights up people, and then it lights up Manderley. Next paragraph, again and again, the rockets sped into the air like arrows, and the sky became crimson and gold. Manderley stood out like an enchanted house, every window aflame, the gray walls colored by the falling stars, a house bewitched, carved out of the dark woods. Is it a house bewitched? Is there this lurking sense? And then the fireworks come to an end, and I'm sure you have experienced this. The fireworks come to an end, and everybody gets up and takes their blankie and goes back to their cars. That's what happens here. It was an anticlimax. The aftermath had come. And finally, she says, thank God they're beginning to go. And they sing Auld Lang Syne and God Save the King. The king at this time was George VI. And down at, let's see, she puts on her smile again at the bottom of page 232, and at the top of 233, I bowed and smiled like a dummy. Oh, yeah. And she says, is there any other phrase? And she keeps saying, oh, I'm so glad, when people would say thank you, and it was a fabulous night. I'm so glad. And she says, I was hemmed in by strangers. 2 paragraphs later, the great hall began to empty. Already it wore the drab, deserted air of a vanished evening and the dawn of a tired day. The language of the end of the ball was was really good. At the top of page 234. If you've ever given a party, and at the end of the party everybody goes home, and then you walk around and there's a little chill. The aftermath of the party, let's see, at the top of 234. The aftermath of the party, I went along the corridor to my room. It was getting lighter every moment. They've been up all night, just saying. There was a little chill, and in the garden there were chairs dragged from their places, and someone left a bag behind a chair. Isn't that hilarious? I just think the detail is so perfect. And there are cigarette butts in ashtrays. Mostly people don't smoke all that much anymore, but this harkens back to Mrs. Van Harper squishing out her cigarette butts in butter and face cream. And so she goes to bed, but Maxine did not come. Oh, it's so sad. Chapter 18, page 235. She finally gets up and realizes that her maid, Clarice, has brought tea. And Maxime's empty bed brought me to the realization with a queer shock to my heart, and the full anguish of the night before was upon me at once again. I wondered why, at the end of this paragraph, I wondered why I minded that, and why the thought of the servants talking about it in the kitchen would cause me such distress. It must be that I had a small, mean mind, and a conventional petty hatred of gossip. Always, I mean, nobody likes gossip, and certainly nobody likes to be the victim of it or the object of it. But she attributes it to her having a small mind. At the bottom of page 235, this was why I had come down last night in my blue dress and had not stayed hidden in my room. There was nothing brave or fine about it. It was a wretched tribute to convention. I had not come down for Maxine's sake, for Beatrice's sake, for the sake of Manderley. I had come down because I did not want people at the ball to think I had quarreled with Maxine. I had come down for my own sake, my own poor personal pride. Next paragraph, 236. There was nothing quite so shaming, so degrading as a marriage that had failed. And therein lies the crux of what she's thinking. She doesn't want to fail. For I had no illusions left now. I no longer made any effort to pretend. Last night had shown me too well my marriage was a failure. All the things that people would say about it, if they knew, were true. We did not get on. We were not companions. We were not suited to one another. I was too young for Maxime, too inexperienced, and more important still, I was not of his world. The fact that I loved him in a sick, hurt, desperate way, like a child or a dog, did not matter. It was not the sort of love he needed. He wanted something else that I could not give him. This paragraph really summarizes what's going on in her head. And then she goes on, bottom of 236. I would not listen to her. Mrs. Van Hopper told her that she was going to fail. I thought her hard and cruel, but she was right. She was right in everything. That last mean thrust thrown at me before she said goodbye. You don't flatter yourself he's in love with you, do you? Ooh, that's really painful. He's lonely. He can't bear that great empty house, was the sanest, most truthful statement she had ever made in her life. Maxine was not in love with me. He had never loved me. So remember that Mrs. Danvers had set this trap for her. What's on my sleeve? At the top of 237. He did not belong to me at all. He belonged to Rebecca. He still thought about Rebecca. He would never love me because of Rebecca. She was in the house still, as Mrs. Danvers had said. So everything in the house is Rebecca's. A few lines later, Rebecca was still mistress at Manderley. Rebecca was still Mrs. Winter. I had no business here at all. I had come blundering like a poor fool on ground that was preserved. That's exactly what it is. It's preserved for Rebecca. On page 238, Rebecca, always Rebecca. I should never be rid of Rebecca. At the end of the big paragraph at the top, but Rebecca would never grow old. Rebecca would always be the same. And she and I could not fight. She was too strong for me. She says that if this had been a mistress, she could have fought back. But A dead Rebecca she can't fight against. On page 239, at the end of the second complete paragraph, they had been married for 20 years and had a grown-up son. Oh, she's talking about Beatrice and Giles. Um, they were very happy. Their marriage was a success. It had not failed after 3 months, as mine had done. This idea of having a failed marriage is really pervasive for her. And remember that this is still 1938 or so. The time is not exactly defined. But one didn't want to be a spinster even in 1938, especially having married up as she has. Next page, 240. Jasper rushed at me and licked my hands in a frenzy of delight, as if I had been away for a long time. Interesting point, because dogs don't lie. And Jasper loves her. My daughter one time made the observation that dogs don't lie. Because another daughter was sitting at the kitchen table, and all of the dogs in the house were staring up at Christy. And my daughter Libby said, "Dogs don't lie." What we were witnessing was that Christy had been feeding the dogs little tidbits. And that's true, dogs don't lie. And here we think that Jasper really cares about her. If we look over on page 242, how far do I need to get? Oh, I'm getting there, aren't I? Oh, good. Okay. Top of 242. No, I said, no, I don't want to go over it and over it again. It happened. It can't be altered now. Perhaps it's a good thing. It's made me realize something I ought to have known before, that I ought to have suspected when I married Maxine. Oh, the self-doubt. Mid-page, she's talking to Frank, and Frank is her friend. He doesn't love me. He loves Rebecca, I said. He's never forgotten her. He thinks about her still, night and day. He's never loved me, Frank. It's always Rebecca, Rebecca, Rebecca. I heard Frank give a startled cry. But I did not care how much I shocked him now. Now you know how I feel, I said. And he says, "Look here, I've got to come and see you. I've got to. Do you hear?" There's a little hint of something here. He needs to talk to her. She has just laid out that it's Rebecca, 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 and Frank was there. So what does Frank know? Um, Top of page 243. I went and stared out of the window at the little clearing where the satyr played his pipes. I have something about that satyr guy. This is his little statue. Okay. A satyr has been a symbol of insatiable sexual appetites. This particular satyr in Rebecca is being viewed by Mrs. De Winter from the morning from the morning room. It was installed by Rebecca, who is represented as having satyr-like qualities, hanging out with various men, being unfaithful to her husband. The whole, all of it. At the end, whoops, I'm not going to read that part. You can't read. But this was installed by Rebecca. I lost my place. Oh, here we are. A fog was rolling up from the sea, and I could not see the woods beyond the bank. It was very hot and very oppressive. A fog. There's a lack of clarity. The sun had gone in now behind a wall of mist. It was as though a blight had fallen upon Manderley, taking the sky away and the light of day. And remember that in Gothic novels, weather is often representative of the people's interior. And we are to gather from this that the eye speaker is immersed in some kind of fog, lack of knowledge. At the bottom of 243, the mist in the trees had turned to moisture and dripped upon my bare head like a thin rain. Jasper stood by my feet dejected, his tail downcast, his pink tongue hanging from his mouth. The clammy oppression of the day made him listless and heavy. So even the dog is feeling the fog. I could hear the sea from where I stood, sullen and slow, as it broke the coves below the woods. The white fog rolled on past me towards the house, smelling of damp salt and mist. The fog, the mist, and lack of clarity. At the end of this paragraph, um, Mrs. Danvers, she said, I knew it was Mrs. Danvers. She had been watching me then. So creepy about her. She knew because she had meant it to happen. This was her triumph, hers and Rebecca's. Next paragraph. I'm on page 244. That diabolical smile on her white skull's face, and I remembered that she was a living, breathing woman like myself. She was made of flesh and blood. She was not dead like Rebecca. I could speak to her, but I could not speak to Rebecca. And at the bottom of the page, she says, Mrs. Danvers. Mrs. Danvers. She turned to look at me, and I saw her eyes were red and swollen and crying. What? I didn't expect that. But Mrs. Danvers is still mourning Rebecca. 245. You've done what you wanted, haven't you? I said. You meant this to happen, didn't you? Are you pleased now? Are you happy? She says, why did you ever come here? Mrs. Danvers. Nobody wanted you at Manderley. We were all right until you came. Why did you stay did you not stay where you were out in France? I did not know what to say. The situation was mad and unreal. Remember the fog? Oh yeah. You tried to take Mrs. De Winter's place. But the poor eye speaker didn't even know. She didn't know Rebecca, so how was she supposed to? But you set yourself against me from the first, she said. At the top of page 246. Um, how long have I been going on? Okay. At the top of 246. You talk as though my marrying Mr. De Winter was a crime, a sacrilege against the dead. And we're going to stop here because I've gone on for an hour and a half. I'm almost to where we are supposed to be. I'm 10 pages from it, a couple pages. But we'll stop here so that this lecture doesn't go on too long. And with that, I will close, and I will see you next week.